to In the Shadows, a podcast where we explore scholarship and discuss invisible student populations in higher education. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Aaron, and Kate, higher education and student affairs professionals in California. We are also graduate students in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program at Fresno State. Join us in this episode as we shine light on students in the shadows.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the In the Shadows podcast. My name is Kate Spencer. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I would also like to welcome my two co-hosts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin Colleen, pronouns she, her, ella.
And my name's Erin Connor, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Awesome. So welcome. We're excited to start this podcast. It's kind of the first that we've ever done as a group. And kind of the purpose that we were looking to do this podcast was looking at different student populations within higher ed that we really don't ever kind of sit and talk about. You know, we have different student populations or student groups that have always been a focus, especially in recent years. You know, we see a lot of research and literature in regards to first generation college students, with regards to dreamers students, but that doesn't necessarily make up the entirety of, you know, what we see in our students. And so with this podcast, what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of shed light, you know, in the shadows, shed light on just different student groups and kind of take a look at what research has been done and kind of just get a better understanding of kind of what we're working with, because any of these students can be somebody who we work with as student affairs professionals or just faculty members or staff members. They can be anyone. And so I want to go ahead and start with kind of where we come from. As for myself, I identify as a cisgender white woman, and I am also part of the LGBTQ community. You know, I've been with my partner for 11 years, so I kind of have that real student focus. You know, I'm always interested in looking at LGBTQ plus students and campus climate, and really looking at policy on what's being done, not necessarily just how students are kind of making sense of the world around them when they come to college, but also like, what are the actual institutional barriers? What can feasibly be addressed that we're not addressing? And so that's kind of been a real focus for myself in regards to a lot of the research I've been doing within higher ed. I will say too, I've also been working within higher ed for almost the last 7 years, currently 6.5. I work within California State University, Fresno. It is one of the 23 CSU colleges within California. It's right smack dab in the middle of California. So that's, you go anywhere, you'll find a CSU campus. But kind of my area of expertise has been within the fundraising sector. So I really have a chance to see a great point of view from the administration side of things. So that's kind of been an interesting eye opener when I've been approaching a lot of higher education issues. So I welcome any of my other co-hosts to introduce themselves and welcome onto the stage, I guess.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think it's also important to mention how identifying like who we are, identities, our interests, to kind of really capture our mindset too as we go along and discussing our student groups. So I identify as a cisgendered Latina. I'm a first generation college student as well. My parents immigrated to this country and really had us thinking about how critical education was for us and how education was the key to be able to to do something other than working in hard labor as they did for so many years and continue to do so. And I think because of those identities, it's really hounded me to think about how students of first generation status or Latinx status really navigate the bureaucracy of higher ed. It's not easy. When I've gone through it as an undergrad, it was very difficult. And now as I sit in like class and we talk and we have conversations about studies that we're reading, it sheds more light that I wish I had someone to really show me the way of how to navigate the bureaucracy of a college campus and where to go to ask for help and where to shine light on the barriers and injustices that I was encountering during my college education career and journey. I currently work at the University of California, Merced. It's roughly about like an hour and a half away from Fresno State. And so really my work, I've kind of really grounded myself in staying in the Central Valley and giving back to, essentially the community that's given me so much. And that's why I think it's important for me to highlight that I've kind of stayed in the Central Valley and continue to work in the area. I started off in student affairs as a student assistant, and then moved after graduation, moved into a staff position within student affairs. And then I currently work on the academic affairs side. And so it's really interesting in the position that I am now to see staff navigating a world with faculty and how that looks like. And so I've lived in a world where I've communicated with students and now shifted into working with faculty on a more day-to-day basis. And it's really interesting to see those two worlds are so different from one another.
Thanks for that, Yasmin. My name is Erin. I identify as a cisgender, heterosexual white woman. I come from a very solid upper middle class background, so it's a little different than my colleagues. But what I was going to say is I met Yasmin at UC Merced when she was a student assistant and I was working in the registrar's office as a staff member. So I'm a little bit older than my colleagues. I am in my mid-30s, and I am from the Fresno area, but I left for about 7 years. I lived in the Midwest. I went to school at a private university there. Higher ed was not going to be my end goal. I was a performer for a couple years, and then I started grad school at the University of South Dakota as a performer. And one of my defining identities is chronic illness and disability. And I became very ill, and this was pre-Obamacare, and I really needed to make sure that I had health insurance. So I ended up leaving performing arts so that I could pursue something that was a bit more steady so I could get benefits. I was very lucky. I moved back to Fresno, and I worked for UC Merced for 7 years, and I worked for Fresno State for almost 4 years at this point. So I have worked in the private sector. I worked at Rockford University in the Midwest, and I have now worked at the UC and the CSU. I just hit my 10-year anniversary actually this past Sunday of working for the state of California. But like I said, chronic illness has been a big portion of my life. So a lot of my interests center around disabled students or students with disabilities. They are referred to either. I have been working through my own issues in terms of starting to say disabled as opposed to with a disability, which we'll talk about further. I'm also passionate about LGBTQ plus students and working with first generation and low socioeconomic students as well. I have worked in student affairs for about 13 years. Registrar, financial aid, I've worked at 2 one-stops. And so I am also very interested in removing administrative barriers for students. There's a lot of bureaucracy in higher education. And I'd say while I'm really committed to working at the public level, there's more bureaucracy when you're working within larger systems because of the amount of students you have. So those are some of my, that's kind of my background in approaching higher ed.
One thing that I really like about us as co-hosts is our real unique perspectives on everything. You know, we all have different lived experiences, and, you know, just within our course and just casual conversations, each of us really have a unique experience that we can bring to the table. And I think understanding that kind of helps us grow. And just to be able to work with my two co-hosts has been like a tremendous, you know, gift to be able to really take advantage of. And going back to kind of what we hope to accomplish with our podcast is also understanding some student populations who, while we may not necessarily identify with them, you know, there is some benefit to understanding them, because like I said earlier, you know, the purpose of this is to look at students who we might be working with every day, who probably, you know, for lack of better terms, don't get the love that they deserve, but, you know, they're still there. They're still our students. They're still enrolled. They're doing what they have to do to earn a college education. And so with our podcast, what we hope to bring to everyone listening is to kind of just talk and see what other people are looking at. For us, we've done some research on different student populations. We are looking to do some episodes on student parents, formerly incarcerated students, you know, students or disabled students like Aaron, you're going to talk about that, but disabled students or with those who have chronic illness. Those are just some of the podcast episodes that we're planning to do. But also looking at what literature has already been done. You know, we're just kind of dipping our toes in it. And so I think this just helps us too, because when we start moving into student affairs and start working with each and every one of our students, we're going to encounter one of them sooner or later. And so I didn't know if anyone else kind of had any thoughts on that. What else are we hoping to accomplish with this podcast?
Yeah, I think beyond just shedding light on these student populations, hopefully to other, you know, staff working at higher institutions, is also being able to be a voice for them on whatever tables we're sitting on that make decisions, right? And those decisions can be, I've encountered sometimes where individuals say, and I've said this to myself, like, I don't sit in a table full of like higher ed leadership, right? Like, I'm not sitting at the table with the chancellor trying to come up with policy, but I call myself a doer, right? Like, a policy is enacted by an administrator, and it's the steps on how to administer that policy is given down to other staff members to work on. And so looking at even like the practice and having the student population in mind and really thinking about, is this practice that we're about to enact on all students, is it equitable for everyone on campus and not specifically for one target group? And really thinking of this idea of like one size fits all. And whether we're talking about different student programmings on campus, ways to communicate with students, with registration and graduation policies, and all of these other bureaucratic things that are happening on campus, it's important to take a step back as staff and really question, do our practices and our policies that we're in charge of allowing the fullest equitable opportunities for all our students on campus?
Yes, I agree with both Yasmin and Kate. I think I also would want to talk about why we chose the title of the podcast, In the Shadows. I think it was a phrase in one of the books we were reading about invisible populations. And the three populations we selected for this particular series, you wouldn't necessarily know that they're part of that part of that particular identity or population by looking at them. I realize some disabilities are visible, but about 90% of them, they're invisible, so you can't tell. You often can't tell that a student is a student parent by just looking at them. You may not know someone was formerly incarcerated just by looking at them. There's so many things, but they're still important parts of the student because it's informed their experience, maybe informed barriers or hardships. And it also may be a source of pride as well, or strength as well. We talk about diversity a lot, and while diversity in terms of race is incredibly important, there's also other forms of diversity, and it's also intersectional. So all three of the populations we talk about, that's not about a particular race or gender or ethnicity. So I think those are other reasons we decided to talk about them. And I think we've also learned a lot throughout this research process. And also, since we've all worked in different parts of institutions and at different institutions and for different periods of time, we have different things we've seen in terms of practices, maybe good or bad, or ways we can improve. So I think there's a lot we can learn in talking about these student populations with one another.
Yeah, Erin, sorry, Kate, were you going to say something? No, I was just going to say, I'm glad that you brought up that concept of intersectionality. And those in the audience, it really means an individual holds more than just one identity, and that one identity doesn't solely affect, it's not a one-way causation. We hold different identities, and they all have an effect on how we perceive our work or our way to interact with higher education. And so I think it's important to bring that up, and I'm glad that Erin brought up that concept of intersectionality and how as we talk about these student groups, there's a lot of other identities that these students may hold that is also important to really think about and look at.
Right. And both of you bring up excellent points in that there isn't ever just one identity that makes us who we are. And there are just some identities that sometimes we don't ever think about being an identity. And then it kind of sneaks up on us. We're like, oh, yeah, no, that actually did have like some effect on how we grew up and how we make meaning of the world around us, whether it's during high school or when we get admitted to college, that affects us in how we then navigate that space. And so even understanding that too, I think just our understanding, we can always also provide like recommendations on what we can do better, understanding that people are going to hold multiple identities, and somebody who, you can have two, just as an example, you can have two first generation students, but you have someone whose race or ethnicity, has a tremendous impact on their first generation status compared to, maybe someone's gender or something like that. And so I think it's important to recognize that when we look at recommendations from different studies, or just kind of what we see based on what we've observed at our institutions, we can't treat everyone under an umbrella. We can try to provide as much under an umbrella, but we have to recognize that there are going to be certain populations that we need to provide more equity in that sense. And so I think that's where we hope to come from when we start also looking at recommendations for what we do as higher education professionals, or what we can offer based on what we've researched and what the literature says.
I think another thing that's important to point out for these different intersecting identities is you may hold many identities of privilege, which I myself do, and then maybe have some identities that may be marginalized. And so just because you may be privileged in a lot of areas, you may have some difficulties in others. And that's why they're so important to intersecting, as opposed to maybe someone else who has multiple marginalized identities. And that's where intersectionality really comes into play, where, you know, if you're a Black woman, it's much different than being a white woman. So I think that's a big reason why we really wanted to give our backgrounds of who we are and how we kind of seen the world, because it's going to give us different interpretations of how we approach higher ed and learn more.
Yes, absolutely. So with that, I just want to take a moment at the beginning of our podcast career to thank everyone who's listening to the beginnings of our journey. And if anybody has any questions, they want to reach out to us as co-hosts, feel free to reach out to us as In the Shadows Podcast info@gmail.com. You'll have our link right on our website. And we welcome you on our journey and into looking at the students in the shadows. See you guys in the next episode.
See you all later.
Woo-hoo.
Thanks for
Thank you for listening to In the Shadows, a higher education podcast. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Aaron, and Kate. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and will join us for future episodes. Clear Day, royalty-free music, is provided by Bensound. Visit them at www.bensound.com. Please visit our website at intheshadowspodcast.weebly.com to review the literature and resources discussed on today's episode. Please share any feedback or ask questions by emailing us at intheshadowsinfo@gmail.com.